exact percentage by which you would reduce emissions is a matter of ongoing discussion, but certainly the biggest single source of emissions in agriculture is nitrogen fertilizer, which is not only uses a lot of gas to manufacture, but also releases a lot of NO2 in its application to the land. And nitrous oxide is a seriously bad greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide. So by committing to organic food and organic farming, which I will continue to do, that is a huge step towards addressing climate change. But it's become clear to me that, as I've explained with my own farm, that's only part of the solution. We have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels with our motive power for producing the crops and for the distribution systems. So one of the things that the Soil Association is doing is it's devoting itself to this transition journey at national level. So next Tuesday we've got our national conference, which is in Bristol. The theme is transition food and farming, and we've got the Secretary of State speaking, and we've got Rosie Boycott, who's just been appointed by Boris Johnson as the sort of food czar of London, and we've got lots of other speakers addressing these challenges. And just to give you some examples of some of the workshops we're running a workshop on renewable energy from the farm. We're running a workshop on city food planning. Just to give you an example of this sort of thing, just up the road from here in Romsey, there is an estate of about 1,000 acres owned by a chap called Tim Natchbull, who's Mountbatten's grandson, who has been approached by Romsey Council because they want to have an urban development on the edge of Romsey, taking 150 acres of his land. And because he's an enlightened sort of guy, he came to the Soil Association. He said, look, I will only do this if we build this urban extension in such a way that the food systems from my farm are reconnected with Romsey umbilically, so that we don't allow the fields, the new urban extension, to be put on the best land. We put it around the edge of the farming system, which will then have a dairy, which would process milk. We have an orchard, we have more allotments, and we have vegetables, because I think in our sort of transition vision for the 21st century, imagine Britain farmed in a way which would be resilient to the food shock I outlined at the beginning. Major conurbations such as Southampton and Romsey would have a food footprint. And if you imagine the new food footprint, it would come, all the fresh and perishable produce would come from in and around Southampton and Romsey. A lot of it would actually be grown within the city. But then the stuff which was slightly less perishable would be grown in the sort of agricultural hinterland around the city. And then the stuff which was higher value and heavier and maybe non-indigenous could travel longer distances, of course, by sustainable systems. So maybe a lot of the food will be transported by rail again, and by even water, and certainly where it's shipped across the world, it will be hopefully part sail-driven ships, or whatever wind equivalent to that is in the 21st century. So it's completely remapping our food systems, not just based on, so Britain farmed organically by the middle of the 21st century isn't just an idea, it'll be a fact, because there will be no alternative. Natural gas will have reached such a price that we won't be able to fix it into fertiliser. We will have to go back to mixed cropping systems. There will be a return of livestock to the east, and there will be more arable in the west. We will have to relocalise most of our food systems. The crucial thing will be that our staple foods will need to be grown by us or by farmers that we make a contractual relationship to near to where we live. And so that means people in Southampton adopting farms around the agricultural edge of Southampton and saying, I'll be there for you if you're there for me. And it's about those individual relationships being rebuilt. So we've got a workshop on that, looking at new models of food systems. I also think that money is going to be an issue, because this is like a sort of infrastructure project on a scale not seen since the Second World War. There's going to be an enormous amount of money needed to do this, and part of the problem is that the value of agricultural land is so high now that it makes farming and food a barrier to people outside agriculture. There's also an enormous reskilling challenge, because at the moment less than 1% of the population involved in agriculture. Is going to be at least 10%, I would say, by the middle of the 21st century that will have to be redeployed in agriculture. And so we have to make a career in agriculture or food cool to the next generation, and also economically and culturally enriching. Now that is an enormous journey in its own right. I mean, I'm a Londoner, I have no background in agriculture, and I think we need to think about how we can give young children an impression of good food and nature, preferably before the age of 11 or maybe even before the age of 8, which sort of awakens in them an impulse to become involved with food systems. So we're involved on a project called Food for Life, which is working in 360 schools throughout England, which is doing that sort of thing. Last thing, I mean, we're running about 12 workshops at the conference, and they're all, in a way, looking at elements of transition. That's how I describe it. Faith in food. This idea is that Britain's major faith communities have become largely disconnected from the sacredness of food, which used to be part of, I would say, spiritual practice. But in the 20th century, there's been a sort of severing of that link. And so we're running a workshop where there are going to be representatives of all the major faith communities talking about how we can rebuild that link. Because actually, if Britain's faith communities all committed to this, that's powerful, because they're networked. And if, for instance, as a Hindu person said to me recently, practicing Hindus ought to buy organic dairy products, at the very least, if they buy them at all. Because if welfare is at the heart of the Hindu philosophy, then it's inappropriate not to do that. So I think there are lots of drivers for change, and a lot of them are to do with the hearts and minds of the public. They're not just to do with infrastructure, but there are things that only government can do. And so we, in our campaign, because I see this as the most important campaign that the Soil Association has run in its history in a way, because what we are talking about, I think, is survival. We will hopefully influence governments to do the things that only governments can do. But I think personally we should always remember that this change has got to come from the individual up, not from the top down. I hope that the Soil Association can rise to the challenge which Monty Don set it when we had this conversation before he agreed to become our president, to become, in the 21st century, a food movement for change. I think that food and energy security will be the most important components in relation to ensuring that the 21st century isn't a century of population collapse. Because whereas we've seen the financial institutions collapse over the last year or so, it seems to me that although it's going to be horrible, this adjustment to the recession, etc., it's almost unthinkably awful to adjust to an equivalent energy and food crisis unless we prepare for it. So I'll leave you with that thought.